Hey, everybody. Today I have with me the super fabulous Alana Schramm, who is a coach. Look at her. You have to go to YouTube and have a look if you're looking on audio. She is absolutely fabulous. She is a coach who works with the subconscious and the nervous system and emotions in this really lovely, playful, practical way that I find really inspiring. And it's so relevant to creativity. So I'm excited to dig into creativity with Alana, what blocks it, what helps it flow, all the things. But before we dive in, Alana, is there anything else you'd love people to know about you and your work?
Yeah, just one thing that
Yeah.
I absolutely love negative emotions. I feel like it's one of the
Ooh.
keys to unlocking creativity as we're talking about. And if you're not absolutely obsessed with your negative emotions, then this is the call or this is the conversation to listen to.
Yeah, you see, this is why I had to have Alana on. And I've been really drawn to Alana's work because when I heard Alana say that for the first time, I was like, what? Because that's so far from my own experience of thinking about negative emotions and creativity. And I am like one of those like really practical people that's just like, get it away, shut it out. I don't want it. It's in my way. It's
Mm-hmm.
slowing me down. I've got writing to do. I don't want to feel like this. Just let me get on with it. So hearing someone speak about negative emotions in a positive way, I found completely alluring. And we're going to dive into kind of what that actually means. So to start with a negative emotion, like there's so many that came up for me when I started writing more strongly than I would have imagined, and more so I felt like than in other areas of my life. Things like overwhelm, things like pressure, things like uncertainty. For a writer that sat down kind of on a Tuesday morning or a Wednesday evening, looking at their blank page, about to kind of embark on a scene or a chapter, and they're feeling all this, like, where do we even start to think of it as anything other than unhelpful and frustrating?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is when we have a negative emotion, oftentimes the first thing we'll do is we'll like try and fight against it. So we're
Mm,
already starting out, maybe having low energy because we're feeling this negative emotion. But then on top of that, we're like fighting against it, which is using even more energy. Let's say you have 10 units of energy, you're using two
yeah.
for the negative emotion, then you're using two to fight it. Now you have 6 units left instead of the 8 that you could be having. So the first thing is kind of just understanding that the combativeness is not necessarily helpful. And then past that point, there's like what I believe and what I've seen throughout my work is that every single emotion, the positive ones, but also the negative ones, every single emotion carries a benevolent and helpful message. And when we can connect with them, we can understand what that message is. So, what was the emotions that you brought up
Yeah. So the
in
the
your
first ones that
example?
come to mind, and I say them because they're probably the most common for me. One
Mm-hmm.
is overwhelm. One
Right.
is pressure, particularly if I'm like trying to fit it in amongst other things, and the third one's uncertainty because there's so many decisions to be made, and like, is the chapter even going in the right direction, and am I even going to be able to find the solution, and like feeling for the words, and so yeah, those three are quite big for me.
Right. Right. Okay. So like, let's take overwhelm for a second.
Yeah.
Oftentimes with overwhelm, it's present because there's this perfectionism underlying.
Mm.
So the experience of overwhelm is like, oh my gosh, there's too much to do. There's too much to do and I can't handle it. So the question is like, why is there this experience of too much to do if sometimes when we just look at our calendar or what plate, it's not like it doesn't match our experience, which then
Mm.
often compounds like, why am I feeling overwhelmed? There's even nothing to be overwhelmed about. But there's this like perfectionism behind it where it's like, in order for this work to exist, like in order for this creative work to exist, it needs to be perfect. And so now creating all these oftentimes unachievable standards. So then we have to really hard to work to create those standards, and then we're getting overwhelmed from that experience. And so why overwhelm is so powerful is because that way of doing things where you're creating these unachievable standards for yourself is not sustainable in the long run. It's also not really fun. So you might have had the experience of like, okay, it's gonna be perfect, and I'm gonna work really hard and grind and get it done. And even if you manage to do it, it's like such a slog. And when your body sort of like pushes back against your forcing yourself to do so much and to do it too perfectly, that's your body's way of saying, hey, what if like there's a better way that doesn't have to be like this? So you can imagine if you didn't have any overwhelm and you were just like continuing on with the perfectionism and the working super hard and the like pressure and all the things, you would, right? You would just continue that way forever and just get really tired, but you'd like keep finding a way to keep doing that. With overwhelm, it's like the part of you that's saying, no, there's something different that's available. There's something more easeful and more fun and more delightful. So it's such an amazing experience to have, because you might not let yourself stop, but your body is working with you to be like, hey, let's change up how we're doing things.
Yeah. So where would you even start with like changing that experience? So like if say say like this week we're recording this on Thursday, tomorrow I've got a writing session like in my diary. I think it's like about 4 o'clock tomorrow, and I will like show up at my laptop and I'll have like Scrivener app that's like the writing software, and almost like no matter how I organize it, I think my brain will still like look at it and be like it is that like there's so much to do, even if I'm like, no, it's fine, it's just this one thing, but it'll be like, oh gosh, like there's this, or you're really behind with it, or you need to go faster, or so again it's like probably mixing things up. But like, yeah, what would be like a first step for anyone that finds themselves in that position, being like, I have a whole book to write, and then you'd be like, no, it's just
I love that. I love that example. So there's two things that comes up for me when I hear you speaking. The first one is when you're having this experience of like there's too much to do, but there isn't actually too much, like on in a neutral way. When you're looking at it, it's like, oh, just sit down and write whatever number of words. When you're having that experience, again, it's like there's this perfectionism of it has to be perfect, right? So if you're thinking of like it has to be perfect when you're writing it, that's like gonna like contract you, right? Because you're like, I don't know, it's like if you go out on a date with somebody and then it's like you have to be perfect, you have to say all the perfect things, and you have to look perfect, and you have to act perfect. You're just like, oh, you can't be in the date, right? You can't be in that experience because you're in your mind and not in your body. So creativity is like it's a partnership between your minds, the brilliance of your mind, but also the inspiration and the intuition and the, that like that magic from your body. They're working together to come out. But if you're super contracted and in perfectionism, you're only in your mind, and so you're really again like slogging to try to to try to get the words out. So the first sort of, I guess, a more practical way of how to deal with that would be to just let it be bad. just let it be bad. Let it be easy. So sort of one of the mantras that I have for myself is it doesn't have to be good. It just has to exist. Like there's this myth with perfectionism that we can create something perfect. But that's not actually what happens when we're trying to create something perfect. We often just create a perfect nothing. Whereas the realistic thing that we can create is just something, something good enough. So allowing yourself to experience like if I just like wrote garbage? Like, what if I just sat down and it doesn't have to be good, it just has to be garbage that's on my screen or on my, paper or whatever it is, and allow that to exist. The truth is, like, what you consider garbage is actually not garbage. Somebody who's like a perfectionist, when they create something, it's actually really good, but it just doesn't feel perfect. So, but the quality is still really good. So that's the one piece. And then the second piece is, as to what you're talking about, is sort of the way that we motivate ourselves. And sort of generally in society, the way we motivate ourselves is with punishment paradigm, is this punishment paradigm. And punishment paradigm is a way of managing behavior with a threat of punishment. So we have examples of that in society, right? Like, you have your parents like grounding you, you have, like school putting you in detention, you have like prison putting you in, like society putting you in prison. And punishment is actually a really effective way of preventing behaviors we don't want, at least beginning. No, it doesn't actually work long term, but that's another story.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily encourage the behaviors we do want, right? It actually doesn't create safety, which is one of the pieces that we need in order to allow creativity to flow. But because punishment is so prevalent in society, it makes sense. It makes sense that that's also how we motivate ourselves. But the problem with it is that it uses pressure and shame as fuel. And in order for expression, right, for creativity to flow up, we need vulnerability, which definitely, like, shame does not allow. And we also, need desire, like, right, the desire, the willingness, the wanting to express, and pressure counteracts that. So it's a perfect storm to, like, just totally block any kind of creativity. And so taking a look at the relationship that we have with ourselves, and shifting away from, like, punishing ourselves for doing something that's not desirable, and instead, like, almost like yourself, you the writer you, and then there's you, the, like, punisher, or something else. How are these two parts of you interact, right? So oftentimes it's like the writer you is like not doing it correctly, and then the observer you, who's observing that writer you, is like, you're bad, and you're lazy, and why aren't you working harder, and you should be better, and blah blah blah. Obviously, if you're receiving that, it's like, oh my god, I'm horrible, and you're not safe, and I have to run away from this, and so it makes sense that we're going to respond by, like, running away, or by getting so overwhelmed, or like, just like, I don't even want to write anymore, and or like fighting back. Or just totally freezing, like, oh, I don't know what to write. It's like everything just gets blocked. So yeah, the second piece to like too long to read version is like changing the relationship with yourself, where you're like, oh, hey, writer self, I can see you're struggling, like, you're having a hard time. What's going on with you? Why is this difficult for you? What do you need right now? And allowing that part to be like, actually, like, you're kind of scaring me with your criticism. Like, oh, right, okay, yeah, I have been criticizing you. That makes sense that you'd be scared. Like, what do you need? It's like, okay, well, maybe we can create some time to do some writing, but, like, not the 7 hours you've been forcing on. Like, maybe just an hour, or maybe just 20 minutes. And it's really amazing when you learn how to communicate with yourself. And again, like, negative emotions is an amazing vehicle for this. You get to, excuse me, you get to actually see what it is you need and how to support yourself. And that's what allows it to be so much more easeful and so much more. Just gonna drink some water.
Yeah, no, do it. Because I've got so many questions. So the first one I wanted to ask, kind of in follow up to that, was because when you were saying about punishment, I was like, oh, I wonder, like part of me like thinks like can assume what that would mean because like, obviously in school like you get like a bad grade or I don't know
Right, right,
detention
right.
or like that, like it's really literal. And I was like, I wonder what that looks like as an adult. And then I like made a guess that it would be you saying like critical things to yourself, but I wouldn't have thought of putting pressure in there as like a kind of punishment. And I was like, oh, that's interesting because like in my sort of unexamined way, pressure just feels like a thing. Like it's just a thing because you have the things and you're trying to get the writing done amidst. I think often it relates to time for me. So it's just like I wouldn't have thought of it as being a punishment. It's just like, oh, of course there's pressure because now I think it's things like needing to make the most of the time, or I've only got this much time. So I wondered if you wouldn't mind speaking a bit to
Yeah.
that. I don't know if I expressed it very clearly, but I just am
No,
super
that's
intrigued by
perfect.
what you said.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's like um it's so hard to use words because as you know, right, as a
Yeah,
writer,
yeah.
words have so many
That has to be
nuances and
the
meanings.
yeah. I love it.
Yeah, so like when you use the word pressure, like there's so many like different nuances and connotations. And so yeah, it's interesting to like not have like specific words for like the specific things, but um there's there's two kinds of experiences that we put in the same umbrella of pressure, right? So there's pressure like what I was talking about, which is like, come on, like you with a whip,
Yeah,
like micromanaging yourself and sort of like
yeah,
task mastering yourself, that
yeah,
kind of pressure. And then there's like, I guess maybe a closer word would be like a kind of like loving accountability, where there's like, okay, here are the facts, right? We have like this deadline that's on this or this time, and this is today, and there's this many, units of time. There's like this many hours or days or whatever. And okay, how are we going to support ourselves to get it done in the time that we have left? That's a totally different way of relating to oneself, where it's like, okay, these are the facts, and how can we show up together? Like you have your fears about not being good enough and not like self-doubting and all the things, and then I have my like wanting to help to support you and help you and get the things done. How do we work together to make that happen, versus like the first one I was talking about, where it's like, I don't care about what's going on with you. You're just inherently lazy and problematic, and you never get things done, and your ideas are bad, and you should be like the energy where it's like one person. I mean, it's really an energy of domination, right? Where one person, like, I know the correct thing, and you don't know the correct thing, and I'm going to tell you what to do, and you better, like, I'm going to beat you into submission, versus like we are co-creating together. And it's even like the fact you're slowing me down, quote unquote, is like helpful, right? Because like maybe it's not about like squeezing everything out of me as fast as possible, and it's about like enjoying the process, and I can't enjoy the process when I'm like wing. So they're like both sides have something to contribute. I wonder if that is like a little
yeah,
bit
yeah. No, it
clear. Yeah.
does totally. Yeah, for sure. And so many things I want to ask about that, but because like you've mentioned the body, and I think like for a long time, and this may be true for quite a few writers, not all, but certainly I know other friends too. Like there's so much that goes on in the head and the imagination, and that can be like a visceral thing too. But certainly also like sitting with a book and reading, you actually don't even often you really need to move apart from turning the page or sitting writing like and then
Right.
when you come to write you're sat still, and it can be like so I think there's just like so many different factors. One, the body is literally not moving, and two, there's so much activity in the brain that like definitely there've been periods where I've had to be like, because it's so easy to almost like forget you have a body. It's like
Totally.
what would but then when you come back to reconnect it can be quite hard. And so this is a very long way of trying to set a bit of context, but then also ask about a specific situation, which
Yeah.
is like, what, because it sounds like you're just so much more in touch with your body than I am. What can someone like me do, who's sitting down and has some awareness of their body, and for example has like a jangly sensation because they might have like been on the go all day. So it might be me having like I run a business, so I'm doing lots of things, and then I might need to sit down and write. And in a different situation, I can use that like adrenalized, excited,
Mm-hmm.
like lots of jangly energy. I can move about and it's fine. But when you sit down to write and you need to like slow down, and I definitely need to like work at a slower pace to be able to go into a scene and visualize it, like any
Mm.
helpful transitions or ways of thinking about that. And for someone else it might be that they're, you know, they've been managing, you know, their family and their kids, or they've come off the phone with people. Like that transition time into writing can be quite tricky, I think. So I
Mm.
just wondered what you'd have to say about that.
Yeah, okay, so first of all, I love the term jangly energy. Like that's that's
Okay, it's
such a
very
vibe.
technical.
No, it's yeah,
Shows
it's
you how
very
good my
scientific.
vocabulary is. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I love that. So the first thing I'll say is like I would challenge your saying that you're not in touch with your body. Or I guess you said you're not as
Yeah,
in touch with your body, but like
I think as
your
you are, I feel like
well,
you have a
but
lot
like
more.
but your recognition of like your sort of like the sort of patterns is right, because you're kind of
Mm,
recognizing, okay, so there's like the jangly energy. There's like the jangly energy that's like maybe helpful and helping me get through like different, you know, other parts of my business. And then when it comes to writing, it's not as helpful.
no.
So even in knowing that pattern, it's like super helpful because now you get to now you get to sort of like plan for the reality of what your body how your body works, right? So
Mm,
you know that like, okay, so I'm going to go out into the world with this sort of energy, and then it's going to take me a second to like sort of come down, or to like become present to this new activity. So I think, like, for example, some people who may not be aware of that would just like transition from one to the other and just like expect, okay, go go go, let's just start writing, let's just start doing the thing. Versus if you know that work, you can kind of insert into your sort of scheduling, like however, you know, like some time to reorient to the new task that you're doing. I think part of the way that the world works is where we're just going around doing things hyper speed, like, and moving from one
mm,
thing to the next, and not really allowing ourselves to settle into new environments. So like, I don't know if you've ever had a pet and, you know, you bring them
mm,
into like a new house or something, a new environment. They're kind of like sniffing
yeah.
around, and they're, you know, it takes them a second to be like, oh, okay, we're here now and we're doing this now. And so it could be like, what would it look like to give yourself time to transition from, you know, jangly energy activities to, you know, this slower pace.
Mm,
So inserting sort of like, or allowing yourself, giving yourself permission to take some time to do that as a first step. And then like practically, yeah, there's lots of things from like the somatic experiencing world. One of the most amazing tools that I love that's so simple is just like physically orienting. So
mm,
like really taking, you know, even like 30 seconds or 10 seconds even, to just like let your eyes slowly roll over your room and just like start noticing things that are really pleasant to look at. And that's, you know, in your mind, you're like, well, I know what's in my room and I know what I
mm,
like, but it's actually in your animal body have that
mm.
experience, because it's a separate, right? It's a separate being than your mind. Your animal body be like, oh, okay, we're here now, and okay, there's that plant over there, and like there's that photo
Mm,
over there, and naturally it will start to be like, yeah, to recognize that it's a new environment and it's safe now, and it gets to,
mm.
so that's just one of the things.
Yeah. No,
Mm-hmm.
I love that. And it's interesting because I think, oh, I don't know. I wish I'd had some of this vocabulary well, you hear it when you need to hear it, don't you? But definitely, like a couple of years ago, there were just certain things I would do that just didn't make sense to me. That from what you're saying makes such sense in terms of like that feeling of like, well, why would you think this is unsafe? It's just this. Like, why would you suddenly like the urge to check things in this that seems to almost make no sense in terms of almost like environmental checking of even checking that the pen's got the cap on or checking that, but in
Right,
this way
right.
that feels like really like when you say it like an animal, it's like, yeah, exactly. Like, 'cause I've had both a cat and a dog, and the way that they would come in and it like feels like that. But I would always think it was just like nonsense. And do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
ridiculous and annoying to have those kind of things. But then it's like, but I've like done them. I'm sure lots of people have too. Like since I was a little kid, like you checking the books are lined up a certain way or checking the, you know, like there is something in that. So I think it's really helpful to sort of hear. And certainly now I think it's far from nonsense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Oh, I love
super
to hear
interesting.
that. I love to hear that.
That's, but you've got such brilliant ways of explaining things. Cause like also I both know and don't know that we do have an animal body. So when you say it like with the animal coming into the environment, I'm like, yeah, that's so true. But then sometimes I'm like, no, you should be better than this. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, right? Like, it's such a, I mean, well, I mean, again, and it's not, I don't think, I mean, we all do that, and it's none of us, it's like that's how we've been conditioned and, sort of like trained in society is to be like, like mind over matter. And,
Mm.
it's like rationality above all
Yeah.
else. And we're not really, we're trained as productive as possible, whatever, right? Like all the toxic
Yeah.
capitalism stuff. Um, and to see obstacles to productivity or to performance as
Mm.
like something bad, like it doesn't, right? I mean, that's even, I mean, we could really extend that out into like, that's the problem with the environment, right? Is like, we're just trying to
Mm.
create without taking any of like how that's impacting other things beyond the product. And yeah, we're not meant to be constantly like moving and doing. There's also making space for the capacity that we have, and we all have different amounts of capacity, and actually tending to our capacity and understanding like, okay, this is what my body needs in this moment, is to take a
Mm.
second to transition. That actually creates so much more energy and motivation, so that
Mm.
even if you took like, you invested like a few whatever seconds or minutes taking care of your body, like the return you get on that is so huge.
Mm.
So we're
Mm.
so reluctant to slow down, but sometimes slowing actually like really lets you stop. And even if you don't speed up and you just end up, the same speed or even slower, hypothetically,
Mm.
often you do speed up, but even if you didn't, it's just so much more enjoyable, right? Like, we're like rushing, and then we're gonna die.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
let's like
Yeah.
enjoy, right? The parts that are like all parts of
Yeah.
our life. Sorry to be
Yeah.
so
No.
morbid. I didn't.
No, no, oh no, you're in the right place with that. I'm obsessed
Okay.
with death, and it's why I write
Okay,
comedy
cool.
is so I can think about death without feeling so bad. You can like,
I love
yeah, so
that.
it's all good. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I love it. You can look at all this. Well, I everyone has their own kind of comedy, but I like it because I can
Right.
be my weird little existential self, but in a way that I can deal with. So I can think about all the
Yeah.
things. Like the minute I'm writing a book that's because I think rom-coms are amazing, but I don't see so many books, particularly for young adults, about breakups, and I'm super interested
Mm.
in that. But for me, it wouldn't be right for me. I wouldn't enjoy it to write a book about a breakup that's just a drama. Whereas if you actually then turn it into a comedy with all the things that kind of happen with that. And interesting, like you talk about like the relationship with self, and in my book, I've got she does a Ouija board, hoping. Well, there's all kinds of things I won't go into for the story, but that the dead grandfather's going to come through, but actually the ghost of her 7-year-old self comes through. So, which was not something that I
Oh,
intended to have. So you've
interesting.
got like the main character who's 17 with her 7-year-old ghost, and it's the relationship between them. And so, which leads on to the subconscious I wanted to ask you about, because I didn't ask my subconscious to give me that, but clearly I am quite obsessed by trying to think about myself at different stages because I do find it quite uncomfortable. to think about, and like kind of janky to think about. So I do it through comedy, but I also know that you're really good about like that relationship with self in other ways. So there's two different things I want to ask you about, and we'll see if we've got time that stem from that. But one is the subconscious, because I think about the subconscious in relation to story, and some writers might, and for example, like I think Ray Bradbury, he's not alive anymore, but he's an author, and he like really talks about like mining the subconscious in a really fun way for all the kind of treasures that it gives you.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that in your work, you use the subconscious in your work, and you probably have like quite a different meaning. Like we talked about, words have these different meanings. You probably have
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
a different meaning because it's not a story lens. But I'm super curious to know how you think about the subconscious. I know that's just like a 30-second answer. It's just like a huge
Yeah.
question. I've just loved on you. What do you think about the subconscious, Alana?
Yeah, what's the meaning
Yeah,
of life?
yeah, yeah.
First of all, that book sounds awesome. That sounds, yeah. I feel like there's such a gap. There isn't that what you're creating, so that's super
Yeah.
exciting. Okay, how do I see the
But just like,
subconscious?
yeah, when you in your work, why do you think like it's one of the things that's listed on your website as things that you work with? Like, why do you think
Yeah,
you're drawn to the subconscious or interested in the subconscious?
yeah. So our 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 conscious mind makes up such a small, our subconscious, conscious mind, which is like, our willpower, our intention,
Yeah,
sort of like the awareness that we have like day to day, that makes up such a small percentage of our reality. Um, Actually, our subconscious is what holds, yeah, and there's different percentages, right? Like
yeah,
10% of like subconscious, or 5%, or whatever. There's like different. But basically, our subconscious houses the majority of the way we see the world, of our beliefs, of our behavior, like for the reasoning behind behaviors. So it's really like why we do the things that we do, or why we don't do the things that we want to do, or why we, self-sabotage, which is not something I believe in. It's not a thing.
yeah.
But anyways, what
Oh,
see as self-sabotage, it's all housed and living in the subconscious. So yeah, I think everybody should be like super obsessed and interested in their subconscious, because that's like, why they are the way that they are.
mm,
And yeah, and again, like emotions, why I'm so obsessed with emotions is emotions are a portal into our subconscious, because our conscious mind are, it's the world of thought and
mm,
rationality. And then that it doesn't translate into our, you can't like think your way, to like, so okay, let's use an example. Let's say you don't believe that you're good enough, like
mm,
you had an experience at a certain age where like somebody said that your work was not good or whatever, and then you like internalize that as like, oh, I'm not good enough, the work I do
mm,
is not good enough, actually even I'm not good enough. And that's like a deep-seated belief. So then you're going to, what comes out into your conscious world is like, everything I do, there's like this desire to prove myself, or to like try to earn my worthiness, or earn love from people, or earn like accolades, because like deep down I don't believe that I'm worthy. And if we're just staying in the, rational mind and the conscious mind, and we're like changing our thoughts, like, I am good enough, no, like just do the thing,
mm,
and we're never actually getting to the, the place where it's like, oh, there's a part of me that's like holding this belief, that's actually feeling really like alone and isolated and insecure and super vulnerable. We're just like out here in the conscious world trying to like, feel better about ourselves. But
mm,
when we have a negative emotion, like, whatever our boss says, like, oh, you typo or whatever, and then we have this
yeah,
like reaction, when we can go into the emotions safely, it creates like a direct path to that part of ourselves that, sustained this wound. And we get to like talk to her and, you know, give her what she needed at that time that she wasn't able to get at that time. And yeah, again, it's like the negative emotion, the emotion that comes through, that's like the portal that like connects the conscious and the subconscious together. So yeah, it's such an incredible source of healing and of power. Oh, and the other thing that I didn't mention is that like, if the part of you that's like being the part of you that's like in your subconscious that's like, let's say, hurt or wounded, um because she's hurt and wounded, she's contracting and, you know, like hiding or, you know, whatever, that when she gets to be seen and like tended to and cared for and like, oh, actually it's okay, I'm fine, like I'm not terrible, I'm not a terrible person, then she gets to be the version of herself that she would, like who she really is when she's not like hiding with her wound, right? So in that healing, it's like that releases so much, I mean, stuff that you couldn't even create in your conscious mind, right? Like it could be like, oh, I'm actually really creative, or like, oh, I'm actually like the part of me that like wants to have loads of fun, or like, oh, it's like this really you know, powerful planner or whatever. There's like all sorts of gifts that are like, that are sort of being held by the wound because it's like, I can't, it's not safe for me to show up. That when that part feels safety, it's like, oh, now I get to, you know, it's like there's so many, so it's kind of like we can go into our subconscious and like find all these parts and like release all these gems and all these like treasures and gifts that we yeah, that are just like stored and waiting for us to come and find them.
Oh, I just love how you speak about it because it makes it sound exciting as opposed to
It's so exciting.
terrifying, which I love. So
Yeah,
working with
yeah.
Alana is a treat to be able to do that. And just a couple of things I'll just say. What's so interesting is that I think I like have been, oh, you might correct me for saying this, but how it would fall out of my mouth is quite slow to realize this in my real life. But it's so interesting that comedy is actually kind of based on this, in the sense of like you talk a lot more in story and certainly in comedy about the characters' wounds that are making them act a certain way, or other sort of story systems will be talking about the characters' ghosts, like things that have happened to them that kind of need reconciling. And there's all this stuff that's woven into story forms that acknowledges like different things that have happened and how we do or don't reconcile them. But then as a person, you can still think, oh yeah, I'm just going to write all these stories, and the story, it shows up in the stories, but in your real life, you're still like, oh, but actually you need to just get a diary and a planner, and it's all very logical and all very rational, and this is how we do it, and it doesn't apply. So it's so interesting to have that sort of like different worlds. Fascinating. I want to ask you just one more question before we wrap up. I could ask you 50 more, which is that, so you talked a bit about the punishment and what that can look like in terms of how we talk to ourselves, the environments, and it, and I don't. This might be a really hard question, but it's like, what's the flip side? Because I feel like in the writing community, and I understand why, in an effort to not do that, there's quite a lot of talk about reward being things like cake or getting to go to a coffee shop, and that and not to diss that at all. I think whatever makes the experience more enjoyable, that's not a bad thing. But in society, like in the same way, I think like when we think about how we like celebrate things, still the first things that will come to my head is like going out for pizza, or for some people that would be
Right.
having a drink. I don't drink, so it's not that for me, but still those other things. But if we were like trying to expand that out, what else, when you're thinking about motivation, do you think is actually effective in terms of it being a reward without being like, now this is a session and now you get your cake? Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
that totally makes sense. That's such a great question.
Okay.
I think things are not as complicated as we make them. So I think like when it's outside of ourselves, we can really like, it's very small, but then when it's with ourselves, we like, it starts getting a bit, like, to use your word, janky,
Yeah.
which I love.
I don't know
But
if it's a real word, but yeah.
it is in this world.
It
It's
is.
become a real word. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's say you, okay, like let's, I don't know, take a like a partnership, right? Like
Yeah.
romantic partnership. And let's say there's the creative you that's like, let's say the whatever, like we'll just use an example of like a heterosexual couple. It's like that's the
Yeah.
woman in the relationship. And then there's like the the guy in the relationship that's the one who's like observing the writer self. So like he is like really like not very nice to the woman, like constantly, like kind of, hey, you're not good enough, and you should dress up better, and you should whatever, like not being very nice. And then once in a while he'll be like, oh, now I'm gonna give you some cake for the thing that you did correctly.
Yeah.
Like, oh well, I mean, okay, that's cool, but that doesn't, it's like it's context dependent, right? Like a cake in that environment, it's probably not going to do very much. Really, it's like, think about the kind of relationship that you'd want to have with your friends or with your partner or whatever, with your family. Like, how do you want to be treated? It's like you want there to be, I mean, I'll speak for myself, like support, right? Like support, trust, like I believe in you, you can do this, right? And then also there's like support, like, and oh, you're going through a hard time, like what do you need? And then like, how do you want to be celebrated, right? Like, oh, just see me, recognize me. We don't necessarily need to do like external reward. I mean, that is also great for sure, right? But it's like the external reward, ideally it's like coming from this like internal relationship. So like, oh, hey, wow, this was a really hard thing for us. And you did it. Like, you did this for us. You sat down, you wrote it out, you're confident. It wasn't like perfect, but you still like sat down and you wrote it. And I see you and I so appreciate you and you're amazing. Like, thank you so much for doing that. And then, from that place, maybe it's like, okay, like maybe let's go, get some cake or go to a movie or, buy a thing or whatever it may be. That's just like icing on the cake. But the real reward is like the way that we're receiving ourselves. Like, it feels so good to celebrate ourselves, right? To like, I mean, and it can, and okay, so like it can be as simple as like, like, what am I celebrating myself for today? Like, what are the good things that I did today? Or like the things that, and not just like successes, right? Like I accomplished something, but also in terms like effort, right? Like you did your best. Like you sat down for 20 minutes and you wrote for 20 minutes. Okay, we had an hour block, but you wrote for 20 minutes. Like, that's like, I'm seeing you. That starts building this relationship of trust where it's like, oh, it's like, it's safe for me to take risks and show up and do work because I'm not only are you not going to yell at me, but you're going to celebrate like whatever efforts I do. Ooh, that makes me want to do more for you. That makes me want to show up in a more, right? Because any kind of creativity is inherently a little bit like, it's a little bit risky. It's a little bit vulnerable because you're showing who you really are. And sometimes showing who you are doesn't feel safe, right? And the first person who meets you is yourself. And if you show yourself and you meet yourself like you're garbage, it's not good enough, the natural, so normal, right, response is to like shy away and like avoid and not, or just do something, like whatever, I don't even care. Like, there's so many like protective mechanisms we have because the way we meet ourselves is just so unsafe. So yeah, it just comes back to like, how can we create this like really safe, supportive relationship with ourselves that allows us to like show up as our, as our full selves.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. You have the best ways of describing things that make so much sense to me. Because even as you were talking about like that example with the guy, I just could feel myself being like, no, that's unacceptable.
Yeah.
Like, whereas, oh well, I'm sure lots of people too have that, have so many experiences and still do. Of, like in some ways, I feel like it would be easier to identify if I was really, really mean to myself. But normally, it's more just kind of. Just like, yeah.
Yeah.
But whereas I would never do that to somebody else. It's just been, it was okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Not too bad.
I love what.
But just.
Oh, sorry.
Go for it.
I'm so excited. I'm like cutting you off.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, and I do like talk a lot about this like more aggressive, like you shouldn't be. It doesn't always look like that, right? It's like kind of relationship dynamics. So there's like more like like aggressive, but there's also the opposite, right? Which is like more like neglectful, like oh whatever, like you there you again watching Netflix when you're supposed to be working, like ugh, whatever, like yeah, just do whatever you want, I don't care. Like there's this like or it's like I just think sometimes I think of myself as like a little kid and I'm like, look at this thing that I did.
Yeah.
And then, like being met with like, ugh, like that's good, okay, whatever. Just like come back when you have something more like amazing to show me. And then like the heartbreak of like, oh, well, okay, well, I won't show you my drawings anymore because you're not very nice. I just won't do drawings anymore. Yeah, so there's like neglect. Right? Neglect is all like a way that we can show up for ourselves. And I think even like when we think sometimes even getting this relationship of trust ourselves where it's like, okay, I'm not going to like create all these like strict rules for you to follow through. That can seem really scary because sometimes we're afraid that if we don't have all of these like micromanaging sort of like pressure, that we're just going to do nothing. And so we associate trusting ourselves with just like leaving ourselves to the wolves and not anything. And that's not trust, right? That's like neglect. Trust is not just like abandoning oneself. It's creating a container of like, okay, this is too much and this is not enough. And like, what do you need to feel like capable of moving forward? And how can I support you with that, right? Like not creating too much pressure, but also not like upping you and doing like not, not creating any sense of like accountability or presence.
Yeah. No, that's so helpful. And thank you so much for all you've generously shared today, Alana. I love learning from you. I've taken one of Alana's courses and it really helped me, and I'm excited to work with her in the future. And thank you so much for coming and sharing with listeners some of these ways of thinking about creativity that might be new to you. And there's so much more to learn. It's very exciting. So thank you,
Thank
Alana.
you so
Where
much.
can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, so I think it's in the show notes. My name is a little bit hard to spell, but it's alanaschramm.com is my website. You can sign up for my email list. I send out emails sort of sporadically, but yeah, the main place that I hang out is on Instagram. So I'm at alana.schramm on Instagram, and the spelling and stuff will be, I guess, in the show notes, right?
They will definitely be in the show notes.
Perfect.
And highly recommend following Alana, because Alana has just such brilliant ways of explaining things that in an area that I find quite difficult to engage with sometimes, or I'm like, oh, I don't have time for that. Alana's always got this way of explaining it where it just like, oh, I actually want to try that. I actually want to do that. Like, that sounds fun, not scary. So awesome. Thank you so much.
I love that. Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun. It was so nice to hang out with you.
Hey.